Telecom Careers, the #1 global telecom and wireless job board, telecomcareers.com. CommScope, thinking beyond today's technology to help you make the best decision for your network and your business. Register today for the Wireless Infrastructure Show, the premier national event for mobile network solutions, produced for the industry, by the industry.
Thanks for joining this week's episode. Is episode 5 of Coders. Our co-host today is Victor Greta. Victor, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, B. Thanks for having me here.
So you're going to be in Austin next week for the Angry
That's right,
Dad
yep.
Gamer Twitch TV episode. What can we expect to see, and who's going to be your guest?
Our guest will actually be a good friend of mine from a long time ago when we first started to CK Sample III. He works with Chaotic Moon Studios, and he's a great guy, but he's also a gamer. He's also a dad, and he can be very boisterous, so he fits in perfectly with Angry Dad Gamer. But he's also a developer, so we're going to talk about all kinds of stuff while he's doing some kind of game with headshots.
Well, today we're going to be talking about 5G networks, open source code, and we've got some interviews with Interdigital. They are a research and development company. They have some 21,000 patents. They've been around for 30 years, focusing on technology for wireless networks. We're also going to have Dan Pitt, who is Executive Director of Open Networking Foundation. Before we dive in, maybe just give us some perspective on your thoughts on open source in terms of what you've seen over the past 10 years.
Well, you know, open source software in general has become a foundation for a lot of companies who are building things. Apple has used it to help build Safari. A lot of our networking protocols and a lot of server technology, of course, relies on open source, because the theory being that these communities have a shared interest in building something, and they want to share that back with each other, and so they can avoid licensing and other commercial issues that can sometimes slow standards and slow the progress of things. So, you know, when there's a sort of use case for it, open source is incredibly powerful as long as people play nicely with it, right?
Well, in my opinion, there's a fist fight brewing. And you've got the carriers on one side who would love to have complete open source and really commoditize the equipment vendors and the software vendors. And on the other side, you have the equipment vendors and the software guys who want to create a little bit of extra sauce in their standards so they can drive up the margins. So why don't we go to this first video clip from Dan Pitt. He's the Executive Director of the Open Networking Foundation.
So ONF was publicly launched 4 years ago last week. We came out of this sort of accidental effort at Stanford University, supported by major operators, network operators, to kind of be able to somehow program the network the way they program, you know, computers. They opened up the network equipment, created a new interface inside that hadn't been named or opened up before, separates control, puts it in one box, a simple server, and the forwarding in another, which is optimized for packet or optical switching. And they talk with a language that was called OpenFlow. This was a PhD thesis at Stanford. But a lot of, you know, industrial representatives of the Clean Slate Internet Design Research Program got very excited, and they said, gee, we should standardize this, and we got to make software-defined networking something that becomes successful in the industry. So they created the Open Networking Foundation, and they gave us this OpenFlow protocol, and we took it as our mission to help these operators leverage software in a commercial way. So we've standardized the OpenFlow protocol, continue to update it, but we've taken a much larger mission to really champion SDN and open SDN for commercial success. So we don't view ourselves as a traditional SDO by any means, standards development organization. We've taken all the things we can do to help commercial success, bring operators and vendors together, for example, hammer out working solutions, instantiate it in code and in real software when we can, and make sure that the open interfaces and the open protocols are done at the right level of the architecture so that innovation can flourish above it in a creative way and below it in a creative way, whether it's in chips or control software or control applications or true business applications.
So Victor, what strikes you the most out of that clip?
Well, I think that it's a really great idea, obviously, for the folks who are interested in commoditizing a certain aspect of the industry, because this is going to benefit people who want to build software, right? But the question is, what are the benefits in creating a foundation like this? What are the benefits in creating a standard like this? And the benefit might have a detraction in some other area. So what are the factors that lead to the acceptance of these standards? And can you get everyone to buy in? So what are you seeing in terms of people who might be polarized on this issue because of what it represents to their business?
Well, again, I think it's a bit of a fist fight brewing, and if you look at the Open Networking Foundation, you've got OpenStack, which is another association, and then finally you've got Open Daylight. So you've got these three consortiums that have formed, which are, in my opinion, for all intents and purposes, lobbying groups at the standard bodies. I think Open Networking Foundation, it's siding with the carriers, which is where it should be. I think what's really interesting about the Open Network Foundation is you've actually got some of the over-the-top guys like Facebook and Google and others showing up in that forum. So when you really think about Facebook or Google, they're communication service providers. Even Microsoft, by the virtue of the purchase of Skype, Apple with FaceTime, they're running hardcore communication platforms underneath their traditional apps that a lot of people don't really think about. So they have a vested interest in these future standards. And we're going to talk later in the show about the importance of open networks and what that really means in terms of how it unleashes the potential of the software community. So at the end of the day, I think the most important thing to take away from today's show is that for effectively 100 years, you've had a closed network. The carriers have guarded that network. No one's been allowed in. And with the network, this 5G network, you're going to see over the next 3 to 4 years a network that's going to be opened up. And I think it's the genie out of the bottle. You're going to see these unintended consequences by virtue of this genie being out of the bottle. So those are kind of some of the key takeaways for me. And I think it's really interesting to spend time with Dan Pitt, who has a long-term telco background with Nortel and some other companies. And he's in Silicon Valley, and he's supporting the carriers from around the world. I mean, you got global carriers, global over-the-top guys. And yes, they have some collaboration from the OEM community, but they're really not the key influencers in this particular group.
Well, and it makes sense, right? Because if things are being pushed by developers, if that's where there's so much money and pressure, right? That's that market pressure that's pushing them to open up those networks, because these guys can then innovate on top of that structure.
Well, you want to jump into the second clip where we'll go into a little more detail about, again, Dan Pitt from the Open Networking Foundation. Let's go ahead and roll that second clip.
I think it has three essential characteristics to be truly open. First of all, it has to be published somewhere, which means, in a document, certainly could be in software, where anybody can come and see it and look at it without having to get anyone's permission. The second, it should be some sort of a standard, whether it's a de facto standard or a committee standard, doesn't really matter. And third, and really most important, it should not be controlled by a single party or a very small cabal of parties. It should be community defined, derived, and improved. And that's the real challenge for the industry, because they've had protocol standards, and you can see based on the sort of the lock-in experience of many operators that they don't have much of a say in it. And we want them to have more of a say, because it's their future that's at stake, and they know that. So we're big advocates of open SDN, where it can really meet the needs of a variety of different types of network operators through separate provision of hardware and software and the creation of software by them or others.
How important is this open network to the future of 5G?
Well, I think it's everything to the carriers. They are buying into this promise of lower cost of operations, lower CapEx. I mean, that is the promise of virtualization. And NFV and SDN are kind of the first elements to be, at the core of this evolution to 5G, and you'll hear it in many of our clips today. So how important is to the future? I think it's everything. And I think the representation of the Open Network Foundation board members that does include global carriers as well as the over-the-top guys, okay, the Facebooks and Googles and Apples, et cetera. I think the battle lines are being drawn now. And I think when they open up the networks and they open up the APIs to the creativity and the innovation of the software community, I think, again, it goes back to my previous comment, the genie is out of the bottle. And I think you're going to see innovation on unprecedented levels. When you talk about the Internet of Things, today the talking points are data surging, 50 billion connected devices, and those are just kind of big talking points. But when you open up the network and you open up devices to the software development community, you really, and again, it's an overused word, but you democratize the network. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens. It's going to be interesting to see how open the carriers and the OEMs and the device providers really allow that network to be.
Well, that's the devil in the details, right? As they're working out the proposals and working out the standards, we've still got a long way to go.
Well, we got one final clip from, again, from Open Network Foundation. So why don't we roll that clip real quick?
What can you tell us about your board of directors?
So our board of directors is all major network operators, and they really want to drive this bus. They formed us so that they could drive this thing. We have 8 major operators on the board, and plenty of other operators as members among our 140 members. But we have 4 main data center internet operators, Google, Facebook, Yahoo, and Microsoft, 3 major telecom service providers, North America, Europe, and Asia in Verizon, Deutsche Telekom in Germany, and NTT Communications in Japan, and then a major enterprise, Goldman Sachs. The whole financial services industry views the network as a really critical part of their business. They're regulated, they're under compliance, they have huge performance constraints, and so it's really important, and they wanted to be at the ground floor of this movement as well. We have 2 independent directors coming from the world of academia representing themselves also.
What role do the equipment vendors have in the governance or programs that you initiate?
We have huge participation by the vendors as well as by the operators. The operators are in charge of appointing the highest leaders, but we have vendors, leading our projects, our working groups, our discussion groups. They're on our CTO council, they're on our software leadership council, they're on our testing leadership council, and all the groups we have. Really, to make this a commercial success, we have to get the customers and the suppliers to agree on practical, workable, engineering-based solutions that can get out in the marketplace quickly and be proven and experimented with and deployed quickly. So we have to bring these parties together.
So Jeff, is it safe to assume that carriers are even going to allow this sort of even playing field, this level of standardization? I mean, it seems like this is a lot of benefit for carriers. And I guess the question is, who would be against this, right? It sounds like the sort of went at pains to say, oh yeah, no, they're involved, and they're sitting here and they're sitting there at the table. But I can't imagine that they're necessarily super thrilled with the fact that this could potentially cut into their profits.
Well, I think at the end of the day, that's exactly what should happen in terms of the carriers, probably for the first time in a couple decades, having some sway. I think they, and again, this is my opinion. I've been on the operator side in terms of starting a competitive phone company, a DSL company, and when you're bidding out or creating RFPs for whether it be a DSLAM chassis or a radio access network, and you've got the consolidation that you do today. I mean, you got 2 or 3 key wireless network providers, you got 2 or 3 routing companies, so your options are fairly limited. And when you're putting out that RFP for a quote or RFI for information, you're going to get fed back whatever the equipment vendors serve you. Okay, so again, you're going to have on 5G over the next couple of years, you've got a lot of lobbying and technical participation by both the carriers and the OEMs in the standards bodies, whether it be IEEE or 3GPP. And I've never been to one of these committee meetings, but suffice it to say, that's where they're developing these standards and coming up with these prototypes. And we're going to run a clip in just a minute from an OEM standpoint. And so you've got vendors that are trying to create proof of concepts today that haven't been and certainly are not in the standard. So to me, I'm not sure if the carriers are going to be able to control the day, but I think they're certainly going to influence the outcome But it goes back to what I started out the conversation. The promise of 5G and the promise of NFV is lower cost of operations and lower CapEx. And so you've got this, I call it kind of creative tension going on with these proof of concepts. And then the standards technical committees coming together, and it's really going to be exciting to watch what happens over the next 3 to 5 years. I mean, but from your standpoint, you're going to hear from Interdigital in a few minutes. They talk about that this is the third wave of networks, but it's really back to the future. So when the enterprise networks went to IP 10 years ago, you saw a lot of virtualization back then. I'm kind of curious what your perspective is in terms of whether the carriers are going to be able to hold sway over the OEMs and software guys.
Yeah, well, I think it could be very well a moot point if there's enough pressure, obviously. And what he was talking about with Facebook and Google and Apple sort of on board with this, obviously it behooves them to empower developers to, tap into the power of the network directly like that. So the promise of this, I think, is so huge that it's going to be very difficult for OEMs and vendors to say, no, we really just want to keep doing things kind of the old way. And I think historically we've seen that when innovation and is so much greater, doing it this way is probably going to win out.
Yeah. Well, let's take a look at this next clip, and it's from Interdigital, and it's Alan Crandall and Jim Nolan are talking about the NFV and SDN as being the cornerstone of 5G. It's a great clip. Let's listen in.
Is the role of software and code in 5G. So I'm going to open up with that question. I'll let either one of you maybe give me your first response.
I could go with that first, Jim, if you like. I think this is a very easy segue into a discussion on NFV and SDN, and these are really probably the two cornerstone topics. The cornerstones on which 5G will be built. As we see it, really what's happening with the emergence of these technologies is we're entering into the third wave of network again. It's a bit of a back to the future move if you actually look at what NFV and SDN are actually all about. But basically SDN is about creating the separation of the control plane from the data plane, and NFV is about pulling service logic from hardware, essentially. These are basically moves that we can mirror back all the way back to SS7 and AIN and the soft switching revolutions of 10 or so years ago. What's really happening, back to your core question, is there's a move to pull all this service logic and these controller entities and create a much more innovative environment for third-party software developers to literally reinvent the way networks operate. So it's a thrilling time, and I think that is one of the things that the 5G revolution will certainly bring, a much more open marketplace for software developers to do incredible things.
So it is, as you said, a thrilling time to be in this stuff right now. The potential of these things is pretty huge. What I'm concerned about is, what is the benefit for consumers? We see the different Gs go up, and so far most of that has been about bandwidth. And of course, once smartphones came around, the bandwidth, really was required at that point, a lot of bandwidth. But now, what is the benefit to consumers with a 5G network?
Well, Victor, if I could maybe just leave you with a second thing to really think about. Had it not been for regulatory pressures, we still would be using black rotary phones, right? So yep. I think the future of 5G is yet to be determined, but I think what you can bet on it's going to be consumer driven, and it's going to be fickle, and it's going to be nothing that we expect today. Again, last 15 years, when the wireline networks were first introduced, you first introduced broadband, whether it be DSL or cable modems, and you saw the wireline networks go from TDM to IP, and you saw this move of innovation, and what came out of that innovation? Google, Facebook, the iPhone. So those are pretty dramatic seismic shifts in terms of what was available to the consumer. And when you look at your core question about what does it mean to the consumer, I think it means choice, and I think it means that the network is consumerized. And I don't know if that's really a word, but consumer will rule, and they will self-select what they want. And if you've been reading the business journals lately, the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, Business Week, you're reading about the pressures on cable companies' earnings and the viewership of certain programming, particularly in the rerun market. And I think that's a reflection of consumers having choice. Netflix, Hulu, and the millennial generation who can pick and choose what they want to see when they want to see it. So all these things are kind of wrapped up in, what is the future? The future is going to be a 5G, and if you go to the conferences, the trade conferences, the big vendors and the carriers talk about things like lower latency and more bandwidth. And I think those do get baked into the standards, but those are not consumer facing. And I remember, and this is really interesting, back in '97, I started a DSL company, and we were trying to come up with different choices for our consumers. So we had 7 different tiers of pricing, because we really didn't know what people would do with bandwidth. But we had a $79 product, and then we had like a $495 product. And it was literally the 80-20 rule. No one really knew how much bandwidth they needed. So by default, 80% of the people picked the $79 product. And that really messed with our business plan, right? Well, what was our counteraction to that? We ended up coming up with 2 price points. We went to $179 and I think $299. And you saw about 30% of the users buy the faster product, because I think 30% of consumers are always going to buy cars with faster engines or Viking appliances because they look pretty. But when you look at the mass market, they're going to probably go to the lower end. So I just go back to, what is it going to mean to consumers? Who knows? But I do think it evolves around the Internet of Things. I do think that the over-the-top guys are going to play a key role. But if I could, Victor, let me turn the question back to you, and kind of through your lens, what do you see for consumers over the next couple of years?
Well, like you said, it's really all about consumer choice. I think it was a huge move that HBO has put its channel on the Apple TV. So even without subscribing to HBO cable, you can actually get for $15 a month the same HBO programming through the Apple. So the consumer shift to where the consumers are basically dictating what they want now, and businesses are actually having to respond to that, and even without regulatory pressures, which is pretty amazing. I think that's really big, and I think that's not going to go away anytime soon. But I think what we're going to see is more pressure, especially for entertainment products that use a lot of bandwidth. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that, a lot more of integration, and customers wanting the a la carte services and, basically everything that they've wanted, and now being able to apportion it out and saying, okay, pick and choose all the services and whatnot that they like, but also get it for a fair price and not feel constrained by it, because I think there's a pinch point right now with the constraints on the network.
Well, let's come back to a conversation. We got a couple more clips here, but let's roll this next clip where you're seeing some deployments, proof of concept deployments in Europe. So let's go ahead and spin that one up, and we could talk more about what the implications are.
But if you look at those radio specifications, that becomes more transparent to the end user in the network. It's abstracted away in terms of what we do with the devices. What's really more important in 5G is cost. It's really about what's the cost of delivery. If you look at today's network, a couple of dollars per gigabyte, and it's still an order or two above what wireline costs are. And I think ultimately 5G is about reducing cost, again, an order of magnitude like the other parameters, from a couple of dollars to half a dollar or less per gigabyte, getting closer to what wireline is. And really, the elements that make up 5G will be more amorphous, more diverse than what other Gs have been, and software is really the driver of that. And what makes it more amorphous is that you don't need to wait until a new standard for many of the innovations to happen. So Alan mentioned software-defined network and network function virtualization, and then there's things in terms of Internet of Things and objects. But really what it all comes down to is it's not one singular standard or group of standards. It's a whole new set of broader capabilities, largely being driven by our ability to do it much faster in software than we could have done it in terms of just doing it in hardware. So I think you're going to see many elements of what will be 5G, and in particular SDN and NFV, before you even see 5G access networks. You'll see a big move towards 5G capabilities, but they'll happen independent of another generation of an access standard.
So traditionally, it seems like it's been a bad idea to wait for standards. So I've seen companies who just kind of put the cart before the horse. Now, in networking, you can't really do that because you have to have participation from a number of different people up and down the chain, right? What he's talking about is basically accelerating the level of the rate of innovation, because now instead of having to wait for hardware standards, a lot of this stuff is going to be done in software, which can be deployed with the push of a button. They can say, here's new capabilities. And so trying to abstract that. I'm interested in your take on this concept, and especially as they're starting to roll out test deployments. I mean, how much of this is actually baked right now?
Well, I think none of it's baked. You started hearing the 5G drumbeat about a year ago at conferences. I'd say started with Mobile World Congress a year ago, and it escalated throughout the year, and then it's almost become in everyone's standard vocabulary today. I think most consumers are probably know intuitively what 4G and LTE means today, and that process took about 4 years for those terms to become like Kleenex in our day-to-day vocabulary. And so, again, for folks in the industry, I remember showing up at Mobile World Congress last year, and everybody was talking about 5G, and I was like, well, and everybody was asking everybody else at the show, what is 5G? The drumbeat's gotten louder and louder and louder, but at the end of the day, the initial Etsy white papers on kind of what 5G is going to look like are just now starting to come out. So I think the standard bodies are coalescing. I think some of the early movers, like an Interdigital and Ericsson and Huawei and Nokia and Alcatel-Lucent, Cisco, Juniper, are all working diligently to be involved in these proof of concepts. I think another, and this is probably the third big key takeaway from today's show, is if you look at technology as an economic enabler, and I think we can all agree, and I think there's some studies from CTI over the past decade that talk about cellular adoption rates in emerging countries equates directly to literacy rates, education rates, and GNP growth. When you look at Horizon 2020, which is a European Union initiative where they've allocated billions of dollars to try to reclaim, if you will, being a center of innovation. So again, if you look back in history, you look at Europe in the early 1920s, kind of they missed the industrialization of the 21st century, and a lot of that moved to the United States. And over the last decade, you've got innovation going on all around the world, and I think Europe as a whole with the European Union, they came together and said, listen, this thing called 5G looks like it's going to be a big deal. And they've allocated billions of dollars for a number of different innovation programs, but one specifically, which we're going to hear from in just a minute, is called XHAL. It's part of that Horizon 2020. There are 21 companies involved in a proof of concept around 4G, and they're going to solve for one specific item, which is just one of many, dozens, that will ultimately be in a standard. But you've got this front haul and back haul, the lack of a management layer to be able between a physical network and a virtual network. And so you got 21 companies. Interdigital is one of those who has applied for and received some money to participate in an initiative. So I think, going back to your question, where are we? You know, it's a foot race. It reminds me of I guess there's that show about Oklahoma when they had they unleashed the wagons and everybody was going to stake out their land. To me, that we're just now starting to line up on the starting line, and you've got all the major players, and I don't even think they've said go yet, but you've already got about 10 players halfway down the field.
Well, that's good in some ways. Hopefully for the consumer, that will play out to be an advantage for them.
And you've got, again, you used to be editor of TUA. You saw Apple that had to create standards on a smartphone before I think anyone was even looking at standards on the phone. So maybe, are there any parallels to what evolved in the smartphone world over the past 7 or 8 years?
Well, one thing that's interesting is that FaceTime was originally intended to be an open standard so that other apps could use it and even across platforms. But there was apparently some secret sauce in the compression algorithms that Apple didn't want to let loose of. So even though it was announced when FaceTime was announced that this will be open and, they didn't say, well, you can use it on your Android phone or anything, but that was the promise initially. It never materialized because of some proprietary stuff. So that's my concern looking at it as a consumer, is that somewhere down the line, people who are with their wagons out there, we really want to protect our interests. And even if it's not the best consumer decision, we're going to do this anyway because we've got the leverage to be able to do that. And someone like Cisco actually does have leverage, like that.
Well, let's roll this next clip from Interdigital. It's they're talking about the XHAL project that's part of the Horizon 2020 program in Europe, and I think what you're going to find is going to bring us back to code and software.
Sure, and I'll even describe it from the perspective of some of the projects that we're working here in London. We're involved in a number of Horizon 2020 initiatives, and they're quite SDN centric. And I can tell you the people that we're hiring here to support these projects are software developers, because the nature of the development work and the research work requires software developers to jump right in and write application level software code on SDN platforms. And so it's very much central to it. And it may not seem like a very logical connection, but we're working on a project in Horizon 2020 called XHAL, where it's basically about unifying front haul and back haul technologies into a common unified management framework. Where is that energy to create that innovation going? It's application level on SDN platforms. Develop the management algorithms, the load balancing software, the quality of service policy controls. It's essential. Software is driving 5G.
So what is your take on this in terms of the time that it's going to take to implement this? Right, we're going to be in a vastly different landscape in terms of smartphone technology, and with things like the Apple Watch, wearables, Internet of Things, all of these things will be crashing down at the same time. So it's good to have these proof of concepts now, but we know that they're going to evolve quite a bit. So I'm kind of curious as to how you see this evolving over time.
Well, I think it ties back to your question about innovation and what do you think we'll see. And the fact of the matter is, I'm not sure we know where we're going to end up, but it's important to see a lot of proof of concepts that are out there at all layers of the stack, whether you be at the network layer or the application layer. And you hear Alan actually talk about the application layer as part of the proof of concept in Berlin, but it's fundamentally part of a network deployment. For sake of time, and well, go ahead. You're going to add a comment?
Well, I think one thing that's important for people to understand is that what I love about this idea is that they're trying to make a big piece of this pie open in a way that fosters innovation both above, like you were saying, both above and below. The both sides of the hall, basically, right? So and that is a practical benefit for consumers, because developers have always found that when you give them access to something like that, they will take advantage of it and create new stuff that we can't even imagine right now.
Well, let's run this final clip, and then Victor, you and I can come back and just talk a little bit about some of the things that we think are going to happen. So let's go ahead and roll the final clip.
Can you talk about the relationship between this Berlin project and U-Haul and the standards body? I mean, you're pushing forward with the proof of concept. In fact, with standards are the ink's dry on any standards being developed. So what is it, creative tension? I mean, how would you describe that relationship?
No, it's very much symbiotic. Basically, this is the innovation model that exists here in Europe. These funded project initiatives tend to serve as precursors to standards activities. So you've got a very large consortium who's basically working towards a consensus and solving a problem over the space of a couple of years. And one of the products of this project activity will be standards contributions and standards consensus that ultimately will be taken into bodies like the 3GPP and the IEEE, etc.
So of course he's hedging a little bit by trying to explain that it's going to take a little while. This is the very tentative first early steps, but I do think it's interesting that the prototypes that they create today, of course, these proof of concepts are the sort of, I mean, these are like beta builds, right? When Gmail was in beta, it's just like, okay, this is what we can do. This is obviously going to evolve. And then you look at Gmail today, and it's a vastly different product than when it started several years ago. So, how long does this sort of thing take, and how long do you think it's going to take us to get to 5G?
Well, the early bets are on 2018 in terms of the next big Olympics. So you'll see some early semblances of standards in 2017. I think one of the answers to that question really lies in the chip manufacturers in the semiconductor industry. So while we were at Mobile World Congress, we met with a couple of the chip guys, including Freescale, and asked that very question. Because when you think about the production cycles and the production lines associated with building a new chip, you've got 18, 24 months to just build the manufacturing process. So I think the answer lies in how fast can the silicon be developed, both at the phone, because all of a sudden you got lower latency, you've got more bandwidth. So you get chips on the phone, you got chips in the network, you got chips in the cloud, and they're all going to have to be orchestrated and work seamlessly. But I think you're going to start to see some beyond proof of concepts in terms of real tangible betas. I think we're in the alpha stage now, but I think you'll start to see some beta applications probably in the early 2017 and real trials in 2018. But I think before you have standards galvanized, you're probably looking at 2019 or 2020.
So it'll take a little while, but it's also the sort of thing that developers need to start thinking about preparing for right now.
Well, I think that's a great comment. Actually, two comments. One, you mentioned Gmail and the beta. So here's a classic example of how the over-the-top guys like Google can just move so doggone fast compared to a traditional telco. And I think that puts incredible pressure on the telcos, puts incredible pressure on the OEMs, because companies like Facebook and Google are Linux servers. I'll just start building my own servers, right? So you see a complete disruption at the server level. But the over-the-top guys are moving so much faster. And Gmail is a great example, and other products out of Google, they beta things, and statistically, the answers show themselves and reveal themselves, and that's how they bake in their products, and that's operating at a speed that is just unknown or new to telcos. But again, I come back to you and I come at the world two different ways. What's your view, and maybe what are some of the other broader reaching implications of 5G and innovation to the software community?
Well, the promise is pretty phenomenal, and I can see why Facebook and a lot of the over-the-top folks are getting involved at this level, because the understanding is, lowering the capex, they can take these things in carriers as well. By lowering their costs, they can take that and then improve in other areas. And this also gives flexibility to networks in a way that we've never seen. I really look at this as it's not just the next generation. It's a couple of steps above in terms of evolution of our networks. And I think for developers, that's going to be fundamentally important, because right now you have to deal with so many things. If you've watched any of my Twitch streams, you know that you've got latency issues. There's so many things that sort of interrupt the experience for consumers, and developers have to work very hard to route around those things, so to speak. So I think that the real innovations here are going to be in more seamless products, in products that work better, and anything that has to connect to the network is going to be vastly improved by the improvements that they're making to that middle layer.
Mm-hmm. Well, this show's about software developers, for software developers, and I think if you listen to Interdigital and the people they're hiring for the proof of concept in Berlin, they're all software developers. And so, what are the bigger implications for the software community? It's all software. If you hear Hans Vestberg at Ericsson talk at Mobile World Congress, he basically says, he doesn't understand why the analyst community still classifies him as a hardware company. He makes a statement that, we're in fact a software company. 60 to 70% of our revenue is coming from software and services. So, the OEMs got to break from that mold. And the Ciscos and the Brocades and the Junipers, they have to break from that mold. And I think it's hard for the analyst community to figure it out. But going back to what it means to the software community, I think it's a huge opportunity for the software community. Now, one of the challenges we're going to have is you're going to have the app developer guys and gals who now are going to have to learn a little bit more about an XML, not an XML interface, but an open networking interface or an API interface. So they're, maybe you could shed some light on the types of skills that the software development community, who in the past may not worked with telcos, what kind of things are they going to have to learn?
Well, it's analogous to when you worked on the web very early on and you still used a graphic designer to do something, or if you were a designer and the web came along and all of a sudden you had to learn a little HTML code or JavaScript or CSS and those sorts of things. So developers are going to have to pay attention now to network stack, and in a way that they really didn't before, that was sort of abstracted for them, I think. If the promise is realized that they're going to be able to tap into things that maybe they weren't able to tap into before, then they're just going to have to educate themselves on the best way to do that. Because if you keep doing it the old way, you're going to find that there are inefficiencies. And I think that really that's another reason why these over-the-top folks are getting involved, is so that they can help educate developers, because it's obviously in their best interest to create an ecosystem where developers can flourish and provide the best services. So that may be one of the reasons why they're really throwing in their hat to try to create this open standard, so that the innovation can actually flow, and then it's going to flow through them, right? I mean, there's an obvious interest for Facebook and Google and Apple to do these things, so that those developer tools can then flow through them, and they can be a sort of intermediary in that way. But you're right that the OEMs are going to have to get on board, and the software. I mean, software is going to eat the world, right? So it's that's the idea, is that so many things that we do, and there are some good articles out there actually about how many things can be replaced by software. But one of the things, by the way, that a smart developer will remind you is that on that list is software developer. So there's also that longer term sort of threat of, well, software is going to be helping to, commoditize network hardware, but eventually it might commoditize software programmers as well. So, but that's the thing. Ericsson's very smart to say that and say, that's what we do now. This is what's really driving things now, and we have the ability to control hardware in a way that we never could before, or at least was incredibly difficult to do. So if they are able to make this happen, it's going to be really a fundamental shift of control and power for some people.
Interdigital talked about the people they were hiring for their European initiatives. They tend to be C+ developers. How hard is C+ to learn?
It's not that hard. It's one of the higher level object-oriented languages out there, and while it's a little bit older, it's not that old actually, and it's easier to learn than C, that's for sure. And C+ is it's been used for quite a while for people who are building very strong, like I guess I should say, bug-free, robust programs, type language. So I think that for a lot of people, the skills that they learn in any computer science degree, they're going to be fine with C+.
Okay. I'd like to close on a conversation about the sheer number of smartphones that this Chinese manufacturer sold in a 48-hour period. I think they said 2 million phones. Is the world order changing? And how do low-cost, high-performance smartphones developed in China for adoption in China, Indonesia, and other countries, how's that going to shake up the mix, in your opinion?
Well, it's similar to the price. It's Moore's law, right? The price of silicon getting cheaper, more powerful, and so you're going to see more powerful devices in the hands of more people, and that's absolutely going to explode again as cost comes down and power goes up. So I'm still wrapping my mind around what this means, right? Because it's the rate of that growth is going to go like this, barring some sort of world economic collapse. That's the one wild card in all of this, of course, is that those economies have to remain, growth oriented in order to support this. But at the same time, the costs keep going down, and these products, just a smartphone from a year ago is incredibly powerful compared to one 4 years ago. So what's out there is already out there. I don't see any end to that growth just yet. And I think it's one of the most exciting areas, but it's one of those things where we don't really know what that looks like, because I don't think that we've seen the sort of adoption that we're fixing to see, as we say here in the South. We're fixing to see a mess, or just some really interesting times as those networks, have to scale up to meet the demand.
Well, from one Southerner to another, innovation is just around the corner. Victor, thanks for joining us today. Just a few closing comments. Victor's going to be in Austin next week. We're going to be live streaming one of his programs to Twitch TV on Monday at 9:00 p.m. Central. Next Friday, we're going to be talking APIs with Apogee. We're going to have the chief architect from Apogee on our show next week, and we're going to be talking about the application layer. Apogee, as many of you know, they raised $50 million from Kleiner Perkins last year. They've worked with many of the carriers around the world, providing that layer of innovation, not just for carriers, but also enterprise customers. So Victor, thank you again for joining us today. Viewers, thanks for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next week. And I guess I do have one final comment. Tomorrow here at the ATX Studio Lounge, which is the world headquarters for RCR Wireless News, we're actually going to have a young Austin folk singer here, and we're going to live stream her event. Folks are more than welcome to come by the Austin studio. Her name is Phoebe Hunt. Look for that on our website. Look for Angry Dad Gamer on Monday night, and then look for Coders next Friday. Thanks for your time.
Coders is a production of RCR TV. To reach Jeff Mucci or to suggest a show topic for Coders, you can find him on Twitter at Jeff Mucci. For all the latest news on wireless code and the whole world of wireless, check out rcrwireless.com.